All right. Everyone ready? All right, great.
Ready. Have fun, everyone.
Good morning and welcome. We will begin in about a few minutes. We're just letting some people in as they trickle in. All right. Good morning and welcome everybody. Before we start, I want to have a chance to introduce myself and SIDW. Today's event is hosted by the SIDW's Inclusive Development Workgroup, which we'll have our co-chairs talk about a little bit. And the event title is Examinations of Linguistic Barriers to Impactful Development Approaches and Interventions. My name is Malvika Rendive, and I am a program coordinator for SIDW. For those who are not familiar with SID Washington, we are the largest and most active chapter of the Society for International Development, an international network that was founded in 1957 to serve as a global forum dedicated to sustainable economic, social, and political development. SID Washington serves as a global town square for the international development community, bringing together people from diverse organizations, disciplines, and career stages in a neutral, independent forum to share information and discuss important issues and challenges facing our community, as we are doing today. There are 3 different ways that you can get involved with us. You can visit us at sidw.org to see what our upcoming events are. We will not be having any events after today, but we do have some events planned for January 2022. Sign up for a weekly newsletter. You can also find the link to the newsletter on our website, or you can follow us on social media to keep in touch with our activities and events. We have a mini poll that we've instituted just to understand where our participants are joining us from and who they are. I will launch the poll now. All right. So we see that a large significant chunk of our participants today are not members. Welcome to SID Washington events, and we hope that you continue to follow us. Returning members, welcome back. And we also see that a lot of our participants today are from the DC area and some from outside as well. Welcome and thanks for joining us today. Sorry. Okay, here we go. So I will be sharing a survey in the link in the chat box in a few seconds. This is important because this survey helps us understand what our participants like, what our participants didn't like, and help us improve events as we go forward. There are a few things to note. This is a recorded session, and we will be sharing it publicly through our network and our social media channels. For everyone registered, you will be getting a link to the recorded session via your email with a thank you note. We also have live transcription, closed captioning available for this session. If you do want it available here we go. It has been enabled, and you can enable it for yourself through your personal settings. If you wish to submit any questions in the chat and questions for the session, please do so in the chat box. We will be addressing all the questions that come in during the Q&A portion of this session. I will hand it over to Brian Ubuntu Olson, who is one of our co-chairs for the Inclusive Development. And my apologies, the title is wrong here. It is the Inclusive Development Workgroup event today.
Thank you so much, Malavika. And thank you to everyone at SID for all of the hard work over the many years to help ground our industry in the forward thinking about how we can do what we do the best and with the greatest intention possible, but also that we're constantly reflecting on who we are and what we can do better. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Ryan Ubuntu Olson, and I serve as a co-chair of the Inclusive Development Working Group, alongside my peer, my buddy, my dear friend, Kaylin Sullivan Fleury. And we are so excited to present to you today this particular session on linguistic inclusion. You might ask yourself, why the heck did this group of people come up with this topic at this time in our world? And it seems so abstract when you think about it, right? But as we were going through all of our focus groups earlier this year, as we in our own lives and all of your lives have been exploring the different ways in which we as development professionals can build our capabilities, but also respond to the needs of those our work is meant to serve the most. We ran into multiple conversations that constantly looked at the ways in which language itself serves as a barrier or as an entry point for doing development well. Whether we're talking about decolonizing aid or addressing gender equality and social inclusion, disability rights, or the good old grand localization that we're talking about now. Our words, the way we use those words and how those words inform the ways in which we conceptualize the world and how we relate to others matter. And so we hope that today's panel will help all of us to become better practitioners and help us to think differently about the way we bring ourselves into the world so that we can ultimately do the work the best that we can do. And most importantly, as I hope all of us development professionals constantly practice, it's important that we also take into consideration, most importantly, the people our work is meant to serve. So I am honored to now turn over to my dear friend and former professor, Dr. Sengal. Dr. Sengal will be moderating our session today, and he is Samuel Shirley and Edna Holt Marston Endowed Professor of Communications and Communication and the Director of Social Justice in the Social Justice Initiative at the University of Texas at El Paso. He is also an appointed and distinguished fellow at the Clinton School of Public Service at the University of Little Rock, Arkansas. This is where we met. He teaches and conducts research on the diffusion of innovations, the positive deviance approach, organizing for social change, the entertainment education strategy, and liberating interactional structures. One of my favorite concepts that I hope you'll all explore. His outreach spans public health, education, human rights, poverty alleviation, sustainable development, civic participation, democracy, and more. And before we go to take it a little bit further, I just want to just say how grateful I am to Dr. Singhal for being here. Dr. Singhal is one of those professors that you uniquely have in your life that changes you, that makes you think differently, that impacts you in a way that opens entire universes simply by being who they are. My favorite story to tell, I've already told the panelists, but I'll share it here, is our very first day of class. Dr. Singhal has us all sit in a circle in the same generic chair. And he poses a question to us. He says, all right, pretend you all are aliens and you are visiting the United States for the world for the very first time. I want each of you to, in the next 5 seconds, sit in this chair in a whole other way than you've never thought about sitting in this chair before. And by the end of that 5 seconds, there were 36 of us in the room, and there were 36 different ways in which we sat in that chair. I share that analogy and hopefully set the stage for today's conversation, because if we think of that chair as the way in which we use language, the words we use, the way we talk, everything that we're about to talk today, that is what we're kind of getting at today. So anyway, thank you so much, Dr. Singhal, for being here. And I can't wait for this discussion. Thank you. Take it over. Your turn.
Ryan, thank you very much. I love the Ubuntu in your middle name. I am because we are. I mean, what could be more inclusive than that? The reason why I may have asked you and your 35 other colleagues to respond to a question, the question being, here's something that you know, the chair, and now figure out a way to sit on it in a way that you have never, ever sat on it before, is because I believe that we grow in the direction of the questions we ask. And the topic that we have for today about inclusive development, our structure is one in which we center our conversation around certain questions with three brilliant panelists. And we hope that we will all grow in the direction of the questions we ask. And of course, we'll also be inviting questions from participants, as Malavika has said in the chat box. I do have to begin with a story, my favorite story of inclusion. It pertains to Abraham Lincoln. We all know he was a tall man. Some say he was the tallest president that the United States has ever had, measuring at 6 feet 4.5 inches. And you add his stovepipe hat and you've got a 7-footer. Lincoln was once asked when he was visiting a battlefield, Gettysburg, by a Union soldier who shook his hand for the first time, introduced himself, saluted the commander-in-chief, the president, and then said, "Oh, Mr. President, you're tall. How tall are you?" And without batting an eyelid, Lincoln said, "Son, like you, tall enough that my feet reach the ground." I'll say it one more time so that we can pay attention to the choice of words. Son, like you, tall enough that my feet reach the ground. So here's a simple question that was posed to the commander-in-chief, the president, a man who was very tall. And the answer was not 6 feet 4.5 inches. The answer was one of deep inclusion. Son, familial, like you, familiarity, tall enough, deep humility that my feet reach the ground. He's talking about the common ground that we all stand on, and that in many ways is what this panel is all about. So just very broadly, the questions around which we hope to grow, two primarily, although these two questions you will see will take some forms as we go to the participants. The questions that we'll ask are, how can development practitioners, community that is you, improve our capabilities through greater appreciation and nuance around linguistic inclusion? That's the question we want to grow around. And then a follow-up, what nuances would be added to the issue of decolonizing aid, gender equality, disability inclusion, indigenous community engagement, and human rights as it pertains to language inclusion. So this is what our robust panel will deal with. And in order that we fully include the voices of the panelists in describing who they are, I am just going to invite them one by one, and I would ask them to introduce themselves the way that they would like to be introduced, and you can keep it brief because we have so much more to discuss. So let's begin with Protasia Kamdambo. Protasia, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor. My name is Protasia Kandambo. I'm from Malawi. I am one of the 24 youth champions trained by USAID's funded project Health Policy Plus. So I am a champion in sexual reproductive health and rights and policy. So basically my advocacy work revolves around these two. And now I'm running some projects in ending child marriages and ending violence against boys in Malawi. And I'm also the founder of Dream Growth Initiative, a youth-led organization that is aiming at elevating the lives of the youth. Thank you.
Welcome, Protasia. And now we go to Natalia Mariega Martinez.
Good morning, everyone. I'm very excited to be here. My name is Natalia Mariega Martinez. I am a communication strategist with the Generating Equity Program in Colombia and South America. And my work mostly involves work towards gender equity. We hope to empower women and girls in Colombia and hopefully to have lessons learned that we can replicate in other places and achieve a more just and better society. Thank you for having me.
Welcome, Natalia. And now to Brenna Kuch. Brenna, take it away.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Brenna Miyagita Kuch. I use they, them, or she, her pronouns. And professionally, my career is in human resources and organizational inclusion. I currently do that at USAID's Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance, working in, again, personnel, diversity and inclusion. I'm also on the board for USAID's Gender and Sexual Minorities Employee Resource Group. And then in my free time, who even has any of that, I volunteer for other organizations focused on gender and LGBTQI+ justice. I also want to say, while I'm employed by USAID, I am not representing them. So my words, my language, if you will, are all my own. So thanks for having me.
Thank you, Brenna. And we'll begin with the first round of questions, requesting or inviting quick answers. And we begin with the very general question of what does linguistic inclusion mean to you personally? And let's go to Protasia first.
Okay, so wonderful question. To me personally, I feel linguistic inclusion means acknowledging diversity whilst promoting equal opportunities and being sensitive to the differences. I'll give an example in my line of work. There are some areas where we go to do advocacy work, but for them to listen to what we have to say, it's not just about the message we're carrying, it's also about how we are presenting it. So I remember this other one time I had to go to a very conservative region where women have to cover their hair. They also have to wear long sleeve clothes and stuff like that. And for them to listen to us, we had to be like one of them. We had to make sure that we communicate to them in a way that it is going to be comfortable enough for them. And we also had to respect that and cover our hairs and all that. So I feel like when we're talking about linguistic inclusion, we're not just talking about speech, but we are also talking about these other things as well. Thank you.
Beautiful, Protasia. Let's go to you, Natalia. What does linguistic inclusion mean to you?
I very much agree with everything that Protasia just said. I would only add that linguistic inclusion might mean using the right, no, there's no right or wrong, but using language, and that doesn't just have to be words, it's also body language, it's also the symbols that are around you. Using language that makes everyone that you want to address feel a part of, not singling out anyone, I mean. And an example of this, Spanish is a gendered language. For instance, in English, a doctor could be a male or a female, you don't know. But in Spanish, when you say a doctor, it would be male, and then doctora would be a female. So when you are addressing groups of people who you want to feel that are a part of and who you want to make them feel included, just to make sure that you are using language that achieve that.
Thank you, Natalia, and for that example as well. Brenna, what does linguistic inclusion mean to you?
Yeah, so thank you both for mentioning nonverbal communication. That didn't even occur to me, so that's a really great point. So to me, I think linguistic inclusion really means, and maybe it's less of a definition than a step, but really understanding the power dynamics historically, and ensuring that language doesn't just include, but really centers those who have been historically oppressed, even if it's inconvenient, right? Which it always is when we're talking about people in power, changing their language, changing their actions. So I think if we want to be inclusive, we really have to understand who has been sidelined and then voluntarily change the words we use and other nonverbal communication. So they know it's safe, so they know that they're welcome. I think linguistic uninclusion, on the other hand, excludes people, it turns them away. And when we learn how our words are uninclusive and we keep doing it, to me, it says, I know this is harmful, but I don't care, or it's not harmful to me, you need to get over it. So that just reinforces those power structures and refuses to listen to those who have been harmed. So I think do no harm really pertains to our words, of course, as well as our actions. And then just a really quick note too, I think linguistic inclusion also means evolution. So our identities, our understanding of ourselves, our understanding of other people and humanity is always growing and changing. And so our language also has to as well. Thanks.
Thank you very much, three of you, for getting us started with a sort of a foundational baseline. And now let's dig a little deeper, unpack this a little more. So this question comes to you, Protasia, first. And it's not that I'm going to ask everybody each of the questions. We have some ideas about how the conversation can move. So Protasia, this question comes to you. How does linguistic inclusion pertain to the notion of localization or valuation of knowledge from your perspective?
Okay, so I believe in saying understanding the context is as important as understanding the language, culture, history, environment. One cannot survive without the other most of the time. And in order to localize development aids or development agendas, one also needs to look at these factors as one of the crucial issues that are going to either make it sustainable or either going to make that agenda live on, or either it is going just to die like that. Because I believe that in as much as one can go to school and learn about the context, one can learn the statistics, one can read them, know them by heart. But if you do not add this element of linguistic, it's going to be hard for you to make any change in the world. And as we are all here trying to make a positive change wherever we are coming from, this element is really important if we are to achieve anything. So that's how I think they are in. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Protasia. Brenna, let's go to you. How does linguistic inclusion in your line of work, in your way of being, pertain to the notion of localization or simply valuation of knowledge?
Yeah, I really appreciated this conversation or the sub-conversation in the last panel. So yeah, I think it definitely applies, right? I think the more white, air quotes, someone speaks, which what does that even mean? A specific type of English, your accent, your word choice, etc., the more intelligent or desirable they're presumed to be. So even like on TV, right? Think of robots or AI, their voices are always voiced by people who have British or sort of white American, but never like Native American or Cambodian or Nigerian or Iranian, right? So like we have so much knowledge valuation just based on just the way that somebody talks. So I would argue that language is one of the biggest impactors of knowledge valuation for an individual, along with, I really appreciated Sarah's example in the last panel, which is your university, right? Where you go to school depends on how smart somebody thinks you are. So I think the more consciously and explicitly inclusive we are, the more we realize that the way someone speaks, the words that they choose, their differences, and honestly, their distance from this sort of white professional culture are really adding to the conversation. It's not a bad thing. And so it's really imperative that those voices be able to lead those conversations, not just join them. But if we, being people from the global north, such as myself, continue letting our biases towards this professionalism, towards this knowledge valuation, if we let those assumptions sort of control how we think about people, we're going to keep excluding them. And we need their voices. They're much more important in these conversations than ours.
Brenna, thank you. And thank you also for the reference to the previous panel discussion and to tie that in. And of course, we know that our three panelists are joining us from three different locations. North America, Natalia, you bring up the continent of South America, and Protazia, you're carrying the beautiful continent of Africa on your shoulders. I'm here in Asia, in India. We've got the world riding on our small shoulders. All right, unpacking this a little bit more, Natalia, I'm going to come to you with a question, knowing again that we grow in the direction of the questions we ask. Why does language matter? Why does language matter? Especially, when we think about gender equality, when we think about decolonizing aid, when we think about disability inclusion. And of course, here we are not just talking about, a word choice perspective, but in the way that we can think and act and be. Natalia.
I think this is such a broad question. This could be like a PhD, but to keep it shorter, why does language matter? Because it's the way in which we interact. It's the way in which we construct power relations. So being able, for instance, in my work, we've worked with indigenous communities, and the language that in which the contracts and the grants are written is English. And that is the language that counts. You oftentimes have a version of the contract in Spanish, but please bear in mind that these indigenous communities also don't have Spanish as their first language. So we are basically like imposing barriers towards a full understanding and a full participation in what we are trying to do. And from development, what we really want is for people to be involved to be agents of their own change. But that can't happen if we are speaking a language that has no relation to them. So for starters, that being able to have people build the way in which they want to transform needs to be done in a language that they can understand. Also, something else, and that's a bit more related to decolonizing development. Oftentimes, be it, for instance, USAID, or for instance, the German cooperators or the Swedish cooperation, they will have local staff, and the staff in the highest positions of power must speak that language, must speak either English or French or Swedish or whatnot. And that means that, for instance, in Colombia, a country with very, very low levels of English proficiency, you are benefiting the 1% who managed to go to the States and study, who managed to go to private school, not the base community that your work is supposed to impact. So that just furthers the gap and the inequalities that you are trying to solve.
Natalia has spoken deeply and passionately. Brenna, let's go to you with this. Why does language matter? And not only from a word choice perspective, but in how we should be thinking, how we should be acting, and how we should be.
Yeah, I'm sure I can totally solve this question in about 2 minutes. So I think the biases and the bigoted beliefs of Europeans were forced onto the societies that they colonized, and that is still really hard coded into our language today, and it absolutely impacts how we think. We're raised in this, in this environment. So for example, which I love to talk about, the gender binary, right? Many cultures were not very rigid in their understandings of gender and sexuality. They would have, identities that we in the US, at least today, would refer to as queer and trans. These were part of everyday life. They were even seen as spiritual or holy. Women also were treated with equal respect. They had positions of authority and power. But today, the colonizer's language, Natalia, thank you for mentioning already, did some work for me, just like how binary Spanish is. We know that's the same with French, Portuguese, Italian, lots of languages. So these languages are overwhelmingly binary, including English, heteronormative, cisnormative, patriarchal, they're ableist, they're fat phobic. This language really reinforces like the oppression that has been enacted on these groups for hundreds of years. So because the world grows up with the faults of these language as part of our lives, we of course end up adopting that oppressive lens. It's not our fault, it's just kind of, again, the environment we're raised in. So this is a lens where gender is binary and fixed, a lens where certain professions are only associated with men, like you were talking about, Natalia. Like an English literary name like congressman or fireman, it's hard coded. So we only think of those professions as being done by men. There's lots of pejorative terms for disabled or queer people. They're used as a very normalized insult, like calling someone lame or gay or saying, oh, I'm so fat. Like these are all insults, and it's insulting to those people. And since the words have been normalized as like a bad thing in our language, they remain normalized as bad in how we sort of see people and think about them, because that's how language works, right? So I think when we look at decolonization, at inclusion, at power redistribution, people from the global north, people with privilege really need to understand how our colonizer language has damaged and continues to damage people who are the most marginalized, or even those who aren't, right? Patriarchy harms men as well. Like everybody's harmed by this language. And then I think we just need to like shut up and listen and take direction from others, like back out of the spotlight. And then lastly, I think as we think about how our language has shaped the way that we think, we need to look at the language that others used and how that has shaped their thinking differently. And I think there's so much to learn just talking to people who've grown up sort of with different languages and seeing how they think and act. Thanks.
Brenna, so passionate and powerful. After Natalia spoke, I was like, yes. And now with you impressing upon us, thank you. Protasia, how about you? Let's have your voice in terms of why does language matter?
I believe personally that what we do is not as important as how we do it. So the how is very important to what. So there's this saying that was going around, still is, disability is not inability. And we have so many consultations happening, and we had some initiatives that were going towards helping these people. And you realize that the consultations, you look at the venue, it's something that is not friendly to somebody who is physically challenged. What are you trying to say? That's just saying we didn't want you here. Why are you here? Because for me is, if this space, if this meeting is something that has to do with people of my kind or the people like me, and then I realized that they didn't choose a venue that was accommodative enough for me, that's a message saying we just painted you there, but then we didn't want you there. So, and also we are looking at consultations of people in the rural areas. We have meetings whereby people are coming in, putting together a document or whatever to ask for aid and whatnot. And then you realize that the people in the rural areas are not there, they are not represented. And also the consultations are happening in a language that they do not know, which is English. So English is mostly accommodative to people that went to school. But then you're trying to come up with initiatives to help these people that maybe didn't go that much further with school. And then you are doing those consultations in a language they do not understand. So why are they there? And also, is this initiative truly for their benefit? Because if it was, then it would have been accommodative enough to them. That means if the donor is there, they don't speak the local language, in my case, which is Chichewa, they have an interpreter there for them. But these people need to discuss in a language that they will understand, and they'll come up with something together, which is very inclusive. So I believe that language matters. It really, really, really matters in these agendas. Thank you.
Thank you, Protasi. As you can see, we are in some ways making the journey from how things were in the past to an increased realization how we are in the present, and we'll of course be talking about what this means for future. Prior to that, here's another sort of intermediary question. And Natalia, we're going to begin with you with this one. The question is, where does the field of development, practice, and scholarship get it wrong when it comes to language? And also ideas about how to improve it?
I think it's easy to just sit and list everything that's wrong with anything. But I think that's something that can actually help. And also it would take away so much work from people in the global north, is to value local knowledge. Oftentimes you have situations in which the only way in which a study is valuable, it's when it's done by a professor in an Ivy League school who was in this country for a certain amount of time. But most times there is very, very valuable knowledge locally. And that knowledge maybe doesn't stem from these fancy schools, and maybe it's not written in English or in French, but these are the people who are experiencing the problems and who are telling you what's happening. And perhaps what we need is more translators. Maybe that's it. To be able to take the knowledge that is being produced locally and take it to where it needs to go.
Got some ways to go, and Natalia, thank you for pointing us in the direction. Protasia, the same question comes to you. Where does, from your perspective, your vantage point, your situatedness, development, getting it wrong when it comes to language? And any ideas you have to improve that?
Yes, thank you very much, Natalia. I really agree with you. What you just said really hits even in Africa's point of view. I mean, in my country, for example, we have received a lot of aid in developing policies for dissemination and making Malawians' lives better. But we have realized that these policies are mostly in a language that is accommodative to our donors or to our aiders, which is English. And then you realize this policy is aimed at helping the people at local level. So this is why we have difficulties in, say, demanding for the implementation of the policies, because these people don't understand. For example, when I go to the villages to advocate and raise awareness, when you're telling them about these laws, they do not know. They're like, we do not know. And even if you look, maybe say, okay, maybe I can leave this book with the village headman so that he can read it and also read it to his people. You realize he doesn't understand the language. He can't. So this also sets as a hindrance to people to like elevating and developing the country. And also we have the element of nation building. Nation building is all about helping people help themselves. But this has not been the notion, because the people that are implementing or that are taking ownership of the projects are people who just know the context, but they do not know the realities on the ground. So as Natalia said, local knowledge is undervalued in most of these international projects. So I believe that if these projects took an initiative of valuing the local knowledge, then the people who are owned, or the people that are there on the local ground, they will take ownership of these projects. They would say, okay, these people came to help us, let us take ownership of this. That will be part of the project. But in this case, we have, like in my experience, they say, oh, so organization came, they did something, they went. We have like irrigation schemes that are being abandoned. Why? Local knowledge was not valued. And these people have just said, oh, the owners will come back and maybe continue from there. They were not included. And then with the language barriers, they couldn't understand each other. So yeah, that's my take on it.
Thank you, Protasia. I have always believed that we talk so much about buy-in, and you know, the whole notion of buy-in is buy into a vision of what I believe is right for you, as opposed to, as you both have said, the notion of ownership, and ownership in its fullness, in terms of full understanding, full expression, and full participation. Okay, well, we are moving right along. One more round of sort of unpacking, a sort of a view to the future before we get to a Q&A from the participants. And let's begin with you, Brenna. The question for you is, how do ideas of linguistic inclusion connect, in your opinion, to the future of development professionals and all the, you know, and of the field, of course? And any ideas about what we should be focusing on and sort of driving our efforts towards individually, collectively?
Yeah, I always have thoughts there, especially when it comes to development professionals. So again, I'm coming from an HR perspective. I 100% believe that we cannot be inclusive in our programmatic work unless we are in our organizations, as well as individually as people, not just employees, but as humans, right? We can't just put on our like inclusion hat when we arrive at work, take it off when we leave. So if we aren't fully invested, it's just not going to actually work. So for organizations, I think this means being really dedicated to inclusion and inclusive language in the workplace, not just being performative about it, but like really being dedicated to that. For individuals, understanding the nuances of inclusive language related to identities that we don't hold or understand well. For example, reading work by disability activists, by trans people, by people from a wide variety of cultures, a wide variety of races and ethnicities, and really listening to them and the language that they use for themselves. I think the best way to truly understand is not to study something. You don't show up at work and Google, like, how do I be inclusive today? But to really connect with those people on a human level and understand like what they're saying and what language they use and why they're using it. I think what we need to get away from is defensiveness or rolling our eyes when someone points out a way that our language is uninclusive. I feel this, maybe not regularly, but I definitely feel it when I, let people know about their uninclusive language. I genuinely try to do this as gently as possible, but it doesn't always work that way. So whether it's a common term that has roots in ableism, like I mentioned before, lame or stupid, these are all based on ableist assumptions, or correcting someone who's misgendering me, which I hate doing, or having to tell someone that a term for a specific race is actually like not acceptable anymore. You can just kind of feel when someone has this veneer of inclusion, but they don't want to say the wrong thing, but they're actually annoyed that they're being corrected. Or they think that that identity or that group is just being difficult. But it's not about them being wrong. It's not about the group being difficult. It's just It's about like, what can we as individuals do to best respect that person or group, be it a specific culture or country or a subset of society, by using the language that they ask, and especially understanding the historical oppression that's happened, which is usually sort of the root or one of the roots of this. So I think we have to do that work individually, of sort of having these conversations, being able to, it's hard. Nobody likes having these conversations, right? It's awkward, but we need to focus on the outcome of our language, learn to wrestle with our own egos, and not get so, I guess, not offended, but annoyed, right? So doing that individually in our personal lives, collectively, we also need to hold each other accountable. We have to get better at having these hard conversations one-on-one. And as organizations doing the work that we do, it's super important to have those conversations with our staff.
Thank you, Brenna. Protazia, what would you like to add?
Yeah, just adding on that, I think personally, we all need individually, we all need to go beyond the classroom context, the things we learned at school, the things we learned whilst reading some books. We need to go beyond that. We need to understand that whatever we do goes beyond these numbers, these figures, these things we read. Experiencing something firsthand is very different from just reading it through. You might be going to a different country thinking you've read all about it, but you learn new things almost every hour. So individually, we need to make room for that change, for that, for extra knowledge to say, okay, I am learning new things. We need to go beyond that. And also, collectively, I think we need to look forward to supporting local implementers. We need to support local linguistic nuances. We need to appreciate those young leaders as well, local young leaders. We also need to look into that, because these are people, or these are factors that will add value to our interventions. So it doesn't just go above we having money and saying we have this money, we're going to make a change. We need to value, we need to support these local things at grassroots level so that our interventions can really be that much appreciated. Yeah.
Terrific, thank you. Well, we have, as you can see through these various questions, tried to unpack, tried to go into a deeper understanding of the importance of linguistic inclusion from the experiences of our three brilliant panelists. And what I'd like to do before I give a little summation and we move to Q&A, I'd like to give an opportunity to each of the panelists very briefly, maybe 30 seconds, if they would like to say something as a sort of a wrap-up, as not a conclusion, but as a way, things that haven't been said, things that you'd like to reinforce or emphasize. And Natalia, let's begin with you.
Maybe just let's think about the society that we dream for ourselves. What does that society look like? In that society, you are represented, you are taken into account, you feel acknowledged, you feel heard. And let's think of trying to have that society that we dream for ourselves be expanded to others.
All right, Natalia, Protazia.
I will still emphasize on what I say, to say what we do is not as important as how we do it. So before we do anything, let's also take into consideration how are we doing it according to that environment's culture and language as well. Yeah, thank you.
And Brenna.
Yeah, I think I'll just reiterate the importance of understanding the historical oppression and where we exist in relation to that. Most of us have some form of privilege, and then really make an effort to listen to the experiences of others. And this has to happen individually in order to bring it to work when we go to work in the morning. And organizations have to understand this and support people in being able to learn that and to be involved in that. and then to incorporate it into our work, right? If the work is mostly led by people of privilege, we can't just keep assuming that everyone is like us. So, thanks.
Well, a big thank you to all the panelists, and just a few thoughts from my end before we, listening to all of you, I've become deeply mindful and aware of a reading that I had in grad school. This must have been about 30 years ago, written by Dwight Conkergood. That may ring a bell for some people. And Dwight Conkergood talked about the hegemony of textocentrism. And you're saying, what is textocentrism? We actually referred to it here, Natalia, when you were talking about Ivy League professors coming and doing research. Remember that the whole academic enterprise or the enterprise of practice is based on text, which means we write things down. So much so that if it's not written, and in my line of work, if it's written and not peer reviewed, God forbid, it's not valid. And Conkergood was questioning that, right? That there are so many different ways of expression, song, dance, performance, as if these knowledge systems did not hold any water just because they were not written. In many countries and in many linguistic connotations, we only value people who have papers. When I entered India, I had to have the right papers, And so if you don't have the papers, you are an alien, yeah? And so again, the use of language and how, of course, we are talking about inclusion, going beyond language, spoken, written, non-verbal, to include other facets of life. And so again, here I come back to son, like you, tall enough that my feet reach the ground. No commander-in-chief, no president, no tall man, but let's examine with full understanding, full participation, full expression, our deep humanity. All right, so Q&A. Kaylin and Ryan, are we doing all right with the way we are proceeding? Should we go to Q&A?
Yes, I think we can do that.
All right, terrific. And I do see some questions in the Google Doc, which I'm being fed from based on what our participants have supplied. So let me see if we can tackle the first one. And I'm going to, in the spirit of inclusion, read all the questions. There aren't too many at the moment, but the idea being that once we have included the voices of the participants, then we can open it up to the panel members to see how they may wish to respond to it. So here's a question, sort of a comment and a question. How do the ways we frame words inform or set the stage for the approaches, structures, and design of our development program? And Brenna, I think this comes from you. How is this problematic? The ways we frame our words. How can we improve? Are gender programs reinforcing harmful gender norms and binary constructs of gender, for example? Thank you for that. Let's see. The other question pertains to the issue of localization, which is a priority for USAID, but it seems it hasn't been reflected in the context of language, either in terms of documentation shared or accepted, or in terms of inclusion of time or budget for translation. So this whole issue of localization. And if we wish to speak to that from the perspective of clearly a big player in the area of international development, USAID. And then a question from Ivan or Yvonne. The question is framed as a technical editor and a native bilingual. Okay. We are cautioned against over-essentializing languages, what linguists would call hard Worfianism. Any language can be used to convey any sentiment. Turkish and Persian completely lack grammatical gender, but that doesn't mean Turkey, Iran, and Afghanistan are paradises of gender equality. Well, thank you for that. Again, we see the value of our participants expanding our conversation. So we have sort of three sets, how do the ways we frame words inform or set the stage for our approaches, the whole notion of localization and responsibility lying with aid agencies, and then of course, the caution against over-essentializing languages. So we can go to Brenna. Let's see, do you want to take a first crack at any of these, maybe briefly? And then, we can hand it over to Natalia and Protazia.
Yeah, definitely. Am I unmuted? Yes, I am. Yeah, so the linguistic barriers, long question that I could talk about forever, but I won't, don't worry, around spaces like gender, disability, and race. How do we frame them? How do we frame words and then set the stage for approaches? So I think, well, I don't just think, I think everyone here would agree. Our approaches are often framed by the people who hold power and money, and usually hold power over the language that is used, such as USAID. And we can't keep doing that. We're just not going to get what we need to get if we keep doing that. So an example that I've been talking about quite a bit lately is understanding gender and surveys, and how do you ask and understand if somebody is being discriminated against or having a different experience based on being transgender. The problem is not everybody uses the word transgender, even if they do not, their gender is different than the sex assigned at birth. So then how do you ask that question? In the US, we say, are you transgender? But in a population, the Hijra population, for example, maybe they wouldn't say, yes, I am transgender. Maybe a Hijra person would identify with some different word, and we would lose our data. And so by using this like very US-centric language in the questions, we're not actually getting what we need, which is to understand how these marginalized populations are discriminated against, or whatever the sort of survey is. And then I think an understanding like the definition of disability varies and has evolved. The definition of race varies and has evolved depending on where, the populations you're talking about, the time and history. I think in the US up until like the 1960s, police only reported on crimes by if someone was Black or white. Those are not the only two races. And so they're always evolving, but it's so hard to deal with in a professional context. If you're doing monitoring and evaluation, any data nerd out there is just like hyperventilating, thinking about like how things vary based on country. And I think this addresses maybe what someone else had mentioned a little bit, which is like, we can't continue making the rules, but then we have to invest the extra money in maybe translation services, or the extra time and research to really understand like the populations that we are trying to work with, create programs for, do monitoring and evaluation for. It's our responsibility to understand where they're coming from, like Protazia said initially. The question, sorry, this had a lot of questions. I was writing response to make sure I got all of them. When it comes to gender programs, I am seeing an improvement here at USAID. I am always the squeaky wheel, and I encourage you all to be as well. When somebody talks about gender, asking, are you talking about cis women of the ethnic majority, or are you talking about, people of gender minorities, people who are disabled, people who are often sort of not talked about in these instances. So there's a lot of erasure, but it's getting better. Sometimes there's active discrimination, and sometimes it's just that these populations are ignored. But as we all know, ignoring marginalized populations just perpetuates their discrimination, right? So I know that was kind of a long answer to a very complicated question, but I think the summary is listen to experts. The experts are the people who live and who are part of the communities that we're involved with in whatever way. Listen to gender minorities, listen to racial ethnic minorities, and really understand their context instead of looking at their context and imposing our sort of how we would deal with somebody in the US is not how we would do that elsewhere.
Thank you.
I had.
Yes, go ahead, Brianna.
Sorry, I had one other response to just sort of weaved in here, Ivan. There is a book called Women with Mustaches and Men Without Beards about how like historically like Persian standards of beauty were very similar. They weren't really binary, but then colonization sort of happened and like split them apart. So now they're these very binary. So anyways, I wanted to respond. I thought that was fun, the sort of question that you asked. Okay, done.
Okay, Brenna, let's see if Natalia and Protasia want to weigh in. Natalia, go for it.
I'm just looking at this comment by Ivan or Ivan, I'm not sure, about the over-essentializing of language and how some languages like Turkish and Persian that are gender neutral don't necessarily reflect into a more gender equitable society. Your comment says any language can be used to convey any sentiment, and I think that's true. But are we using it to convey any sentiment? And I think that's the question there. The idea is not to come up with a new language that makes everyone feel included, but to use the tools that we have at our disposal today in our languages today to be able to do that, to be able to convey the sentiments of those people who have been marginalized.
Thank you, Natalia. Protasia, and there are a few other questions or comments that have come in, which I'll read, but first let's go to Protasia.
Okay, yeah, just going on Brenna's question. Yeah, so the same in Malawi where when we talk about disability, the first thing that goes into people's mind is physically challenged. So we have a problem with mental disabilities being underlooked. So we're looking at, people just think when we say disability, it means somebody has a body challenge. But then we're looking into more. So you see that with this language, when say, oh, that person has a disability, that's the first thing they're going to think about it. So it's more like people don't realize that some disabilities cannot be seen, they're not visual. Yeah, and also even with the gender programs as well in Malawi. So when you're talking about gender, it's either you're male or female. Even if we're going to talk about meetings where it's LGBTQI sensitive, it's you have to know how to title it so that the people can come to the meeting. Because if you just put it out there, people are not coming. Because this is almost like an under-talked, this is like a taboo talking about it. So you can see that now the language also plays a big role in order for us to move into development as well. Yeah, and also responding to Amy, I think it's Amy. Yeah, so yeah, that's very true, because when you're talking, we are looking at budget for translation, it's almost all the times overlooked. So we have, say, 1,000 copies of a certain policy or a certain document, and this is going to be maybe 800 English, 200 local language. But if we see who that document is addressed to or who needs to read it, you realize that these are the people that do not understand. So we have a lot of policies in people's offices because they cannot disseminate it, because people will not read it. Otherwise, it's also just going to be trash. So yeah, I mean, this is also a problem that needs to be looked into, and maybe we can, or if you're talking about inclusiveness, we also have to look at that. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you all. We've got some other comments and questions that have come in. We are going to wrap this session on Q&A, wrap this Q&A session in a minute or two. So it's important that we read and acknowledge the questions or the comments that are made. And then I'll give each of you a very quick round, if you wish to address any of these issues. So Caitlin asks the question, have you seen any movement toward embracing plain language in development? And here the references to eliminating jargon. And one of the comments from Ivan, it's good feedback for us. It says, why was the event description promoting this panel so thorny and hard to read? That is, again, what it points us to examine the way we propose the panel. What impediment does jargon and cliche present in the effectiveness of the work we do? So that's one set. And then from Ross, first there's a comment which says, in contexts with many diverse language groups, it's often quicker and cheaper for a project to use a dominant language or two and not take the time to listen to all the language groups or ethnic groups that a project may impact. Well, in many ways, we are doing this conversation in English, so that in itself is a commentary on the point that is raised. And then the question is, are there successes or failures people can share regarding bringing minority language groups on board with a project? And this comes from Ross. So I'd say we have about a minute, certainly not more. It's good that we've acknowledged what people have said and asked. And Brenna, a few sentences, any point that you'd like to address?
Yeah, I'll respond to sort of the conversation in the chat. Things have to be translated, and I think we're not doing our jobs. We're not completing that project if people can't read them. So, people like USAID have to build that into the funding. I can't solve that, and I don't have a response for how to do that, but I think it's really important for people to continually bring up. Yeah, and I think, just lost my last train of thought, so that's it. Thanks.
Okay. Protasia, let's go to you, and then Natalia, you close it if you have any particular point to address. Protasia.
Yes. Addressing Ross, is it Ross? Yeah, Ross's
yes.
Question. Yes, I mean, in Malawi, we have this other tribe called Yao. So these people, they speak Yao. Most of them just speak Yao only, not any other language. So this is a community, these districts are where there are high rates of child marriages, high rates of teenage pregnancies, high rates of HIV infection rates. But all our documents and contexts, they're all in English. So how do we help these people? Now you see that most of the interventions fail because of this. And also some of the factors contributing to this are traditional or beliefs. So if you don't take language, in this way we are talking about the belief, their language is their belief. We cannot help these people for better if we do not understand. So you see that most projects fail in these communities. Why? Because of these language barriers. So yeah, very true. We have to look into that.
Thank you. Natalia, closing thoughts based on the comments or questions?
On that same point, and when you have many minority languages, and I understand we can't all be polylingual, and there has to be some cost efficiency here, but there are ways to be able to bridge that gap. If as Protasia was saying, the only language is English, then it's not gonna work. But maybe we can think of something where, yeah, maybe we produce things in English, but we also have a local person who is maybe translating into a local language, or who is engaging constantly with the community and can create a sense of trust within that community to be able to build upon this.
Thank you, Natalia. And in so doing, I thank all our wonderful panelists and all the participants with all the good questions and comments, including feedback, which we embrace. And Kaylin, I'm going to hand it over to you. Just before I do, a small story. I was once in an audience with His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and a question was asked of him. The question was, Your Holiness, how do we treat others? That was the question. And his response was, what other? Maybe we can think about that. So onward to you, Kaylin, and thank you again, panelists.
Yes, thank you all so much. What an incredible panel. And thank you for your moderation, Dr. Singhal. That was amazing. So I know some of you might be leaving, but stay on the line if you'd like to continue the discussion. I'm going to be providing a little bit of information, and then we can go into some breakouts. So we want to continue this conversation in breakouts, and we also want to continue it on our LinkedIn group for the Inclusive Development Work Group. So I'm going to put that LinkedIn group in the chat, and we would love you to join. We, as a working group, post a new topic each month for discussion, as well as share job descriptions and resources related to inclusive development. And so we would like to continue this conversation about linguistic inclusion there. We'd also love to stay in touch. So I'm going to put the emails of Ryan and myself, as well as the speakers and moderator in the chat, so that if you have any follow-up questions or would like to collaborate further, you can stay in touch with us. So I'll put those there now. Great. And so please do, copy these if you'd like to take them. And then with that, we are going to be moving into some breakout rooms for discussion. And these will be kind of open-ended, just a chance to further reflect on what you've heard here. And so we'd like to hear, what are your reflections on the panel, ideas that stuck out with you? What would you like to add to this conversation? This is such a huge topic. So, what things do you wish we talked about more? And then also, what are you thinking of taking back to your work from this? So I will put those questions in the chat, but the conversation can follow sort of whatever way organically that you and the participants in your group have. And yes, thank you, Brenna, for putting that resource there. I meant to mention that the speakers and moderator gathered a number of resources for us in advance of this event. So we'll work with Malvika at SID to make sure that those are put into our notes from the event, and we'll share those on the LinkedIn group as well. And so let me get those questions for discussion in the chat. And one other request that Ryan and I will make is that if you have any key takeaways or interesting points from your discussion, that you please share them with us. We would love to be sure to flag them for our LinkedIn group and for our other members who weren't able to make it today. So yes, any questions before we head to breakout groups? And I want to thank you all, to the moderator and speakers again. So many exceptional points. I think, it was really an amazing experience to listen in. Okay, great. So with that, Malvika is going to be sending us to breakout rooms, those of us who are staying on the line. And please stay in touch. You can see our emails again if you scroll up a little bit in the chat. And we look forward to hearing about your discussions. And thank you, panel. Have a great day, night, afternoon, everyone.
Thank you.